I'm here today with Reverend Dr. Eileen Campbell-Reed. Eileen is visiting associate professor of pastoral theology and care at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. She also teaches for the Women's Leadership Initiative MDiv program for Central Seminary in Nashville. Eileen is co-director of the Learning Pastoral Imagination Project, a longitudinal study of ministry following 50 pastors and ministers since 2009. She's the author of An Anatomy of a Schism and the State of Clergywomen in the United States. She's also founder and host of 3-Minute Ministry Mentor, a weekly video, blog, and podcast providing resources that inform and inspire the practice of ministry. But today we're here to speak with her about her new book, which is called Pastoral Imagination, Bringing the Practice of Ministry to Life. So Eileen, it's really a pleasure to have you here with us for this interview.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks, Brian.
So we've spoken in the past and we've, exchanged things in the past. It's the first time I think that we've actually done an interview together. So it's really great.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm so grateful to have a little background with you, but to be here today and talk about my new book.
So before we get into that, maybe you could give folks a little bit more information about your background besides that brief bio that I read.
Sure. Happy to. I grew up a very devoted Southern Baptist, and by the time I was in high school, I realized that Southern Baptists were not interested in a person like me, a woman called to ministry. And so as I made my way through college and seminary, I made my exit from Southern Baptist life, and I became part of the new Baptist groups that formed at the time, the Alliance and the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. And those were the places that nurtured me as a new young minister, serving a church in Georgia for about 5.5 years. And then I went back to graduate school to Vanderbilt University, which brought me here to Nashville in the year 2000, and I'm still here. I graduated, I did finish my program and finished that up in 2008, and I have been working, teaching seminarians and new pastors and doing research with how people learn and practice. And I've been doing that for the last really 12 years now, a little more. And I've done it several different cities, but I still live here in Nashville with my family. My husband and daughter here with me. And during the pandemic, we've all been very close, all in the same house, all doing our work right here. So we are now fully vaccinated, my husband and I, and we're ready to, maybe go out to dinner or something.
What a concept. What a change.
Yeah, right.
I love Nashville, and I really have enjoyed doing a variety of different things with people from Vanderbilt Divinity School, graduates and then
Yeah,
people there.
it's a wonderful place to have gotten my education. I draw on it every single day.
I can totally see that.
Yeah.
So before we talk about the new book, tell us a little bit more about the previous books that you wrote.
Sure. I started out writing really while I was in seminary as a field education student. So I started writing for all kinds of what I call ecclesial publications, curriculum for churches, devotionals for churches. I wrote 2 small books while I was serving in the church in North Georgia. One of them is called Being Baptist, and then a couple of other study guides. And then I did a lot of writing for women in ministry, and I was very interested in that, and that's partly what took me back to graduate school. And while I was in the church, I had this experience of looking around and seeing so many other women in ministry. Particularly, I was in a Baptist world, a progressive Baptist world, where there were women in ministry, and I was wondering about how they were in many ways thriving. And yet somehow it was in the face of so much adversity. There was so much opposition to women even being in the ministry in Baptist life. And it wasn't just limited to Baptist life by any means. Other denominations also have their troubles with welcoming women. And if they do officially, doesn't mean it's an easy path for women. So those questions really took me to graduate school and helped me pursue a doctoral degree in religion, psychology, and culture to try to unpack what it is about. I went with the question of how is it women cope, even though they are sort of facing challenges on every direction. And so I wrote a dissertation, and then I translated that into a different kind of book, my first academic book called Anatomy of a Schism, which was taking the interviews I did with women and thinking about them, not just what they told us about how women were surviving or thriving in ministry, but how looking through their lives we could see what really was at stake in the split, the schism of Southern Baptists during the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s. And what I was able to articulate in that study was that there was a lot at stake in that split. And it wasn't just a political fight, and it wasn't just a fight over the Bible or whether it was inerrant or not, or what the meaning of the interpretation of Scripture was. It really was what was really at stake was the question of what it means to be human. And when women entered into ministry, they raised the question just by showing up of what it is to me to be fully human. If I'm fully human, then I'm fully called by God, and I'm here in this place doing this work. It upsets the balance of a lot of things that we were pretty in this society and other parts of the world very devoted to, which is keeping some kind of order, supposed order that God had created, which made hierarchies, which are a setup for a lot of bad stuff. So I wanted to see what was really at stake, and it was both theological and psychological, and what it means to be human. And those women that I interviewed were demonstrating that fighting over what looks like a Baptist or even a Christian fight is not always just what it looks like on the surface. There's often some really deep stuff at stake. And so that's really what my first book was about. And that was 5 years ago.
Okay. I mean, how much of it comes down to power?
For sure, power struggles are a part of what is happening. What happens, though, and had been the case with most of the writing about women in Baptist life up to that point, was women were treated as an issue, something that the men fought over. This side was all for women. We lift them up, we hold them up, we think they're great, we keep them on almost a ministry pedestal. But we don't pay them very well, and we don't promote them very well, and we don't treat them very well, but we're all for them. And on the other side was, no, women are only belong in the role of in the family, of taking care of children and submitting to husbands, and they can work, of course, but they don't have the full authority that men need to be pastors. And so women were just in both of those arguments an issue. I say like a football tossed back and forth, and one side would think they'd won, then the other side. And so the power struggle was really between men about women. Instead of putting women at the center of the conversation and seeing what their agency and their power was in the situation. And so by centering the stories of 5 women in that book, I said, actually, they have a lot at stake here for themselves, and they have a lot to show us about what it means to be Baptist. And they redefine what it is to be a Baptist person of faith and a Baptist leader or minister. And they reinterpret what it was to be Baptist in that period of time. And they still are. We still are, by leading more and more directly and in more and more widespread ways as time goes along. So sure, Southern Baptists still aren't ordaining women on the whole. There's a few exceptions you might find here and there because of local church autonomy, but Southern Baptists aren't going to do that. But the new Baptist groups are flourishing places for women. Women are finding places. Now, all of ministry's in trouble right now, right? But in terms of the gender equity, we're moving more toward it in those new progressive groups.
Good.
Southern Baptists are back there in the...
Well, what can you say?
Not much.
Yeah, I mean, some people, some places evolve quicker than others. So, I mean, that's obvious in a lot of dimensions. But,
right.
So for people who are not very familiar with the 3-minute ministry, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Really, to talk about that, it's helpful to say I had spent about 8 or 9 years studying ministers and pastors in all different denominations as part of the Learning Pastoral Imagination project, which I coordinate along with my research partner, Chris Sharon. And that learning was just so well, just such a deep well of ideas, insights, and wisdom. And we had written a number of academic articles and a 5-year report that's a small book about the way we had been learning in the first 5 years of the research. But the fact is we didn't have a broad platform for getting out what we were learning into the hands of ministers and chaplains and activists and pastors and priests, like in a more immediate way. And so it started to just come together to me that I wanted to make it possible for people to learn with us what we were learning in the LPI project. And the best way to do that, sure, was to write a book, which I've done, but it was to start by just like giving them, in this day and age, what we needed was just small bits, very focused content on what it is to learn in practice. Because so much of seminary education is about learning with your mind. It's about wrapping your mind around really difficult concepts and learning to argue well and write well and preach well. But when you start moving toward preaching and care, you realize you can't learn everything with your head. You have to learn it with your full emotional self, your heart, and your convictions, and your body, and your relationships. And how do we teach that? Well, in theological education, we don't do it all that well. And so 3-Minute Ministry Mentor is about showing the people who are at any stage of ministry, really, but focusing on people who are new to it and helping them think through, how is it I know what I know or know what I don't know by body, by relationship, by emotion, by being in the experience itself. Learning and practice only happens over time. And so 3-Minute Ministry Mentor was launched in Advent of 2018 to make this kind of learning available to as many people as I could get to listen in with me each week. And they started, the first full year was just 3-minute videos, which were also available as podcasts. And then I'd write up something different in a blog to kind of support that. And we started to build an audience of people who were curious and interested about learning and practice. And we made sure every week that we delved into one topic. We used a story to go deeper in that topic and unpack it. And that I shared a resource beyond myself that would help people go even further into understanding. And I always ask a good question or 2 or 3 to help people with their own self-reflection about their learning and practice. So that's what I offered the first year, every week, 50 weeks of material, and that became the 50 chapters in this book,
Okay.
Pastoral Imagination book.
Well, one of the things I most like about what you just described and what you did over the last 3 years was that, you were clearly thinking outside of the box. I know that term gets overused, but I still run into so many people that are locked into the mindset of, well, I've got to write a book or I've got to be a preacher. I mean, the old models of communication that we had predominantly
Right.
were preaching the pulpit or writing a book, or if you were big enough, maybe to get on television or whatever. And, we've got all these incredible other means of communication that are at our disposal now,
Yeah.
right? So we use these words like platform and what have you, but guess what? I mean, it's just another form or set of forms of communication. Social
Yeah.
media, podcast, video interviews like this. I mean, so, kudos to you for thinking about, okay, the objective is how do I reach people, right? With how I'm trying to help them. The objective isn't writing a book.
That's right.
So I'm really glad that you had that vision. But I'm also really glad you turned it into a book now too.
That's right. Yeah, no, and it was a really organic and I would say even beautiful process, because week by week I was working with a video crew, so I was having professional videos made, not just me on my phone. I mean, that's great, but I wanted it to be something people wanted to actually tune into and engage with. And so I'm basically teaching them every week, but I'm telling these stories about people who are in the research project I've done. I'm getting permission to share those stories each time. I'm going back and forth with the people in our study. So it's a very relational process to even create this content. And then I have to protect their anonymity, so I can't bring them on screen. But I'm telling their stories with their full permission. I'm sharing them with people, and then I'm inviting people to think about the questions with me. And I feel like in a way, sometimes it was so, um, we're so provocative with the questions, and asking people to reflect that they're a little surprised that somebody's not just asking like, what's your favorite breakfast cereal, because there's so much of that kind of question asking on Twitter and Facebook, and it's important and it's a good social connection. But I'm asking them questions like a seminary professor asks, right? What would it
Good.
mean for you to think theologically about this in this different way? And I'm really putting those questions to them. And so, we've had a slow building audience, but it's been, I think, an organic one. And it seemed just right then to take those 50 topics and put them into book form. And when I actually wrote the book, a lot more material came in than I
Okay.
could even produce in that
Hmm.
first year.
Hmm.
So it is season one of 3 Minute Ministry Mentor plus plus
Okay. Okay.
in the book, because I added more stories, I added more insights, I added more questions to every chapter. So there's more possibility for reflection. And I really thought about how would people use this book in seminary settings and in peer ministry groups and just for their own personal reflection.
Okay.
So that helped it expand into even a richer, I hope, offering to the world.
So the title of the book is Pastoral Imagination. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. It's kind of got, at this point, it's important to say it's got three meanings. First of all, pastoral imagination is a concept. And it's a concept that is connected to the idea of phronesis. Phronesis is a Greek word which Aristotle used to help us understand, help his readers understand, his followers understand practical wisdom, how we know to do the right thing in any given situation.
Hmm.
And that kind of practical wisdom requires knowledge and understanding of know-how, how to do things. And it also requires being fully present to grasp the whole situation. And it's a hard wisdom to learn. And yet we use it all the time. We use practical wisdom in everyday activities all the time. We don't emphasize that kind of wisdom or learning very much in seminary settings or higher education in general, because we're really worried about ideas and what we do with the mind. But this is a holistic and integrated kind of knowing. Pastoral imagination is practical wisdom. It is phronesis. It is knowing how to enter into a pastoral situation of any kind and what to do. That situation might be the hospital room at the where you have a dying patient. It could be on the streets where you are an activist or protest leader. It could be in the pulpit. It could be at the business meeting. It could be at the city council. You enter as a pastor or a minister into all kinds of situations. How do you know what to do? How do you know what to pay attention to? Pastoral imagination expresses this capacity for knowing how to read the situation and knowing how to act with risk and responsibility for what you do, and to lead people with you so you're not just out there on your own. And so the idea, the concept of pastoral imagination is rich. It's got so much to it, and it's learned over a whole career or a whole lifetime. Um, the second meaning of it is that it's a research project. Most people hear pastoral imagination and they go, oh yeah, that's a research project, right? And it is. Chris Sharon and I have been trying to understand how is it people learn pastoral imagination over time. So we started interviewing seminary students in 2009, 10, 11, and we have rolled that out, and we're now at the 10-year mark with those same 50 pastors, ministers, priests, and religious leaders. And we have been following them they're from 10 different seminaries, and we meet with them every few years, and we interview them and find out what's going on in their lives and in their ministries and how they're learning and growing. And then, of course, the third thing that is pastoral imagination is the book. It's actually got I wasn't planning to title it that, but that's what my publisher recommended, and they're absolutely right. It's the right title for the book.
So you mentioned, there were 50 people that were part of that study. Is the book really focused on those 50 or some subset of those 50, or does it go beyond that?
Yes and yes.
Okay.
It is focused on the 50 as a whole, and I do some reporting in the early chapter, the introductory chapter, about the study as a whole. And then multiple person stories. I never have gotten, I need to get the exact number. I think it's 37 or 38 of them have a story told about them in the book. And some of them will be in my next book, which I was already working on, and this one leapfrogged ahead of it. But uh, there are also stories about students that I have had in the past, stories about pastors and ministers that I know, stories about pastors and ministers who are in the study but weren't in that 50. So we had another group of 25 who we only interviewed one time. And that's because they were further along in their careers. So there's some of their stories are in this book. And then there are stories about me. And that was a bit of what I wasn't planning on. But turns out, if you write about learning in practice and by experience, it's hard to leave yourself out.
Sure. No, it's good
Yeah.
that you didn't.
Yeah. So it ended up having, there's a part of the book that has a kind of quality of self-reflection or a memoir. I would never call it a memoir as a genre, but it definitely draws on my own learning and experience. I tell stories from being a seminary student, from being a new young minister, and from being a theological educator and learning in practice.
Very cool. Very cool. So in the book, you write about the stakes of ministry. What do you mean by
Yeah, I don't mean the thing you get on a plate with a potato.
that? Different
Right.
stakes.
Different stakes. Chris and I really started learning about this idea of the stakes of ministry in conversation with Chuck Foster and Patricia Benner and David Woods, who were our early advisors to the LPI project. And the idea of the stakes of ministry are that ministry is not just a whim or just a job or just something that people do because they couldn't do something else. Ministry is about life and death. Ministry is about the spiritual weight of what we do in the world. Ministry is about caring for people through trauma and grief. It's about preaching prophetically to make a change in the world. It's about showing up when we need the people who care about the sacred to show up. And so when you're in seminary and you're kind of thinking about this as a job, you don't always realize, oh, ministry's got high stakes, but it does. It matters what you do and what you say. We think, oh, the medical profession, they're the high stakes because if they do something wrong, somebody dies. Well, the reality is we can misstep, and somebody who's come to us and is feeling suicidal, for instance, it can be a matter of life and death for them, how we respond, how we show up to trauma, etc. There's so many ways that the stakes of ministry are high. And, there's sort of the old, and for good reasons, distrust of ministry as being, they don't work very hard. They only work on Sunday mornings. They're, sort of the negative stereotypes. And we wanted to overcome that and say, this is really hard, powerful, beautiful, complex work. And we want to understand what it's like from the insides by looking at it in a lot of different lives. And what we see is how much is at stake in what people do. And that means the cost personally to doing ministry is really high. And so people need to learn to take care of themselves spiritually and physically and emotionally in order to be up for that high stakes work.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I mean, pastors help people deal with the most difficult things that they ever have to deal with,
That's right.
right? So,
That's right.
the stakes are high, as you said, the stress is high, the impact on both the individuals, the pastor or the other person is very high. And so, It's not to be taken lightly by any
That's
means.
right. That's right. Doesn't mean we can't have fun or we don't enjoy it, but it is not something to take lightly or as if it doesn't matter, because it really does matter.
So from a practical standpoint, how do you expect this book to be most useful to people that have not been familiar with the entire project?
Yeah, well, I hope that it's going to, there are certain audiences in the world like like seminary classrooms where they still haven't adapted to the idea that they might, in general, watch videos as a way of teaching and learning. Although this past year has certainly put
Yeah,
us further down the road there, right?
yes, definitely.
Yes, but there's still the idea that you have a syllabus and you have a list of books and you want students to be able to read. And books are more durable, right? I mean, we'll make this video and people will watch it, and in 3 or 4 years from now, it'd probably be hard to find this video.
Right.
But books have a more durable quality.
Absolutely
And
true.
so what I really hope is that by putting these ideas into this particular book, a whole lot of people will find use in it over the long term. And so particularly, I wrote this book for people who are in what we would think of as the novice and beginner stages of ministry. Maybe they're college students, seminary students, or in their first 5 years serving as chaplains or pastors or priests or in whatever ministry role they're called to. And so focus specifically on them to help them think of those early questions about how you get it right, how you learn from missteps and failure, how you learn to be there for people, how you learn to care about things like equity and transforming injustice. Because those are hard questions to learn, and no matter your convictions or your head knowledge, when you get in that moment, in that live situation, it what we call in the study and in the book pulls you up short. And when you get pulled up short, you've got to rethink because there's sort of no connecting point. How do I get from here to there? And in that precipice, you have to decide, how am I going to enter in? And there's nothing specific to prepare you for that, but there's everything you've done to prepare you for that moment. And so we want to help people I want to help them by supporting them with these ideas so they do imagine ahead of time. We talked about in the early article we wrote about called Holy Cow, This Stuff is Real. And the subtitle of that article is From Imagining Ministry to Pastoral Imagination. And the wonderful idea about that is that we start out looking and seeing what other people are doing and what we think we ought to do. And eventually over time, it becomes embodied in who we are and what we do. And so we stop just imagining ministry out there and we start to embody a pastoral imagination. And that transition it needs a lot of support. And so my book is one of the ways I want to support people in that transition as they learn and grow, cultivate a pastoral imagination.
Well, it sounds like it'll be really useful for a lot of folks. So I hope it does get picked up by a lot of seminaries for their coursework and also by folks that have already graduated and are out there in the
Right.
real world.
I have a lot of friends who are in ministry many years as I have been, and they found what we're doing in this project really helpful because it's anytime we ask reflective questions, it allows us to stop and really ask ourselves what we're doing. So in that regard, my second tier of audience is anybody who's in ministry. And the third tier is all the people like me who teach and educate for ministry or support through judicatories or denominational groups. All those folks who support as I call it, the ecology of learning ministry. I hope this book will be helpful to all of them. It was written with all of them in mind.
Well, given all the challenges that ministers and churches are going through these days, it's just been, exacerbated over the last couple of years. You know, all the support, all the practical guidance that they can get, I think is appreciated.
I hope so. I really hope so. Yeah.
So what about for you from an author perspective? Have you got any ideas for future books that you can talk about yet?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I sort of hinted a minute ago about this one, Leapfrog. So I finished my book in 2016 about Baptist clergy women. And I was in the middle at that point. We were 6 years into the study, a little more, 6.5 years into that study, the LPI project, and I knew I wanted to write a book about clergy women in the U.S. context. There have been books, there have been a few, but one of the things I ran into was that there was not updated statistics. And so one of the first things I did toward that next book was with some research assistants, we went out and gathered data across a bunch of denominations and figured out what are the numbers looking like for women in ministry right now and LGBTIQ folks. And those numbers are really hard to come by. Getting any kind of statistics about how many queer clergy there are serving in different denominations, super hard right now. Maybe it got better in the last year or two, but when we were trying to gather the data, it was super hard. But we got what we could. We put it into a report. I put it into a report because what I figured out was that various magazines and journals and whatever, not academic journals, but public, sort of more public-facing journals, really weren't interested in me trying to write an article about this. They either wanted more or less, or they didn't quite get it. And the fact was, it was 20 years since we'd had this data across all these denominations, since Barbara Brown Zickman and her colleagues wrote Clergy Women, An Uphill Calling, and Dolores Carpenter wrote a book called A Time for Honor about Black clergy women. We hadn't had anything since those books came out that told the whole story. So I said, I'm tired of waiting on anybody, and I can't wait till I get my own book out. I'm just publishing the report. So that came out in 2018. And then I launched 3-Minute Ministry Mentor, and all that content production just started rolling out. And it was clear this book was going to happen. So the other one's about 40 to 50% written, and it's not a statistical book. That's only one piece of it. It's all kinds of stories about clergy women in the study, the LPI study, and about the dynamics of what's happening about women's leadership in general in this country and how that impacts the church and church leadership.
Good.
And so that book is partially written. I'll be looking for an agent because I want to find a press where I'm really writing for an audience who wants to just turn the pages and really read the book to understand this set of puzzles about how it is that clergy women are doing right now, what their impact on the church is right now, how they're thriving. And let me say, during the pandemic, they're not thriving. Clergy women are sort of just like other women across every profession. They are bearing the brunt of what's happening during the pandemic. Women in our study, a significant number of 50, like I think for sure 4 that I know of, have stepped aside from ministry during this season.
Wow.
Because they have small children at home, or even teenage children. They are bearing this brunt of moving church online, family being at home, homeschooling, and all the stresses of the pandemic. So they have borne the brunt of it more than the men in our study. And that's not to say men have not borne any. They have had stress as well. It's just immediately evident that it's impacted women in really dramatic ways.
Well, there's been many studies beyond just the whole clergy situation where that's been shown to be true.
That's right. And so those are some of the things that I'm writing about in the next book. And this summer, teaching done, book launched. A lot of my hours this summer are going to go toward getting more words on the page in that book. And I run 4 times a week. I gather with other writers at the writing table, and we just spend 1 good hour writing in 2 Pomodoro. We use the Pomodoro technique, 2 poms. And so people are writing all kinds of stuff, and that's the way to get it done. Show up, put words on the page, keep your momentum going. Don't become overly attached. So I do a lot of writing coaching. And
I was gonna say, you've been reading Anne Lamott, haven't you?
Long time ago, yeah. Robert Boyce is my real inspiration at this point. He helps us know how to write with fluency, he says, and productivity. And not just to be productive for the sake of like being part of the big neoliberal machine, but because we have important things we want to say, right? And if we're going to get them to the world, we have to put in the time and the energy to get them to the world.
Well, wonderful. Good to hear that there's more coming.
There is more coming.
Well, thank you so much, Eileen, for all the work that you've done and for spending some time with us to share it with us.
It's great to talk with you, Brian. Thanks for the questions and for the space to talk about the book and the study and the concept of pastoral imagination. I want more people to grasp it so that they can just have some good ways to think about the beautiful work they're doing in a broken world that needs them to do it well.
Good, good. Well, I'm sure it's going to help a lot of people. So I'm glad to see that it's come to fruition.
Thank you so much. Or come to life, as we would say.
Right, right.
All right.
All right. Thank you, Eileen.
Thank you, Brian. Take care.